Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I'm very, very grateful to be here today, and a bit saddened because I missed Tony when I was here 7 years ago. What I remember most about Tony was he gave me some really tough comments, frankly, on my early work on segregation and the work with Matt Jackson on categories. I remember having coffees with him at Autonoma where he gave us some constructive criticism. And so when Matt called me early in the morning and said, you know, we've decided to give you the prize honoring Tony's name, my first response was, does he know about this? At any rate, I'm very grateful to be here to talk a little bit about the work we've been doing in K through 12 education in America and its relationship to similar problems around the globe. Let's start out with the racial achievement gap in America. So what I'm showing, there's a lot of lines here, but what I have here is that the blue bars denote proficiency rates in 8th grade math on the top and 8th grade reading on the bottom for white students. The red bars denote it for black students and the green bars for Hispanic students. There's a few things I want you to get out of this. The first is that just across the board, you should think of proficiency as kind of grade level equivalence. Are you doing math and reading at grade level? So in America, roughly 43% of students are doing math at grade level, and roughly 40% of students are doing reading at grade level. The next thing I want you to see here is that there's not a city in the United States in which more than 25% of black students can either do math or reading at grade level. There's not a city in our country in which more than a quarter of black students can do reading or math at grade level. I think that's, I don't mean to be alarmist, but I think that's a crisis. The third thing I want you to get out of this graph is that in places like Detroit, where there's tremendous poverty in the inner city, only 3% of 8th graders can do math at grade level. Okay? When they're in 4th grade, it's actually 2%. So I did the calculations. There's about 6,600 4th graders in Detroit public schools. If you take 2% of that, that's roughly 132 kids. You could fit them all on 2 school buses. Okay? There's just not a lot of high achievement going on in our cities, and especially in regards to our most disadvantaged populations. And that's a shame, because if you take actual education achievement, some of you may be thinking, hey, well, Roland, test scores don't matter so much. Well, let me show you that they do matter. What I have here is data from the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth in 1979. These are individuals who are roughly 40 years old now, but what I've done is to go back and look at their test scores when they were in 8th grade, okay? And so we have several dimensions of inequality here in America, and what I'm doing is saying, here's the raw inequality amongst the 40-somethings. And here's what happens if you just compare 2 individuals who had the same 8th grade test scores, okay? So the first column here is wages. These are just hourly wages. There's a 28% difference between blacks and whites in terms of wages in the raw data, okay? That's a well-known fact. What might not be so well known is that if you just account for 8th grade test scores, nothing else, not the poverty of their neighborhood, not the education of their mother, nothing like that, nothing complicated, just their 8th grade test scores on tests like I just showed you. That 28% difference in income becomes 0.6%. If you look at any college, this is all the way on the right here, this is pretty astounding. So there's a 27% difference, negative, of whether or not students will go to any college in the raw data. If you just account for 8th grade test scores, actually, minorities are significantly more likely to attend college. If you look at the probability of being on public assistance, like welfare, 141% difference in the raw data. Once you take into account just 8th grade test scores, that goes down to 33%. On nearly every dimension you can look at, whether it's teen pregnancy, here there's a 126% difference between racial groups, which goes down to 20% when 8th grade test scores are taken into account, health outcomes, and criminal outcomes. So if you want to, in the 1950s and 60s in America, this likely would not have been the case. There was all sorts of institutional racism and discrimination, and some of that still may go on. But if you had to change one thing to try to eliminate large fractions of inequality in America, it would seem, just in the correlations, that education is really, really important. And so if you, McKinsey, the consulting company, just recently came out with a report a year or so ago, and they calculate that if you take the racial differences in student achievement and you were to equalize those differences, the shock to the economy would be roughly $300 to $500 billion per year. Now let's look how we compare internationally. The U.S. spends the fourth most among OECD countries. They're led only by Luxembourg, Switzerland, and Norway. Yet when it comes to actual achievement on tests like the PISA or the TIMSS, the United States is ranked roughly 20th. Okay? If you look at Spain, Spain spends roughly the OECD average, yet Spanish performance is slightly under the OECD average. Okay? If I were to take the United States bar here and break it apart and just say, how are disadvantaged populations in the US doing relative to the more advantaged populations? Well, the Asians and whites in America would be right up here by Finland when it came to educational achievement. They'd be doing quite well. If I looked at Black and Hispanic students in America, okay, they'd be doing worse than any other developed country. They're far worse than Mexico, for example, despite the resources that we put into our K through 12 education system. Okay? And again, if you look at economic growth, if we were able to close the gap between us, between America and Finland, then you're looking at somewhere between $1.3 and $2.3 trillion injected into the economy through lost GDP. Okay? The point of that is to say these test scores are very, very important. They're correlated with all sorts of inequality within America, but if inequality is not your thing and you just care about economic growth, it's correlated with economic growth as well. So the issue is, how do we actually close those gaps that you see? Because there's roughly a 1 standard deviation difference or 2 years difference in the performance of Black and white students. How do you actually correct that? So one of the first things we did was we wanted to understand how early in life the gaps actually begin. Okay? So we stumbled on some data, which was from 10,000 9-month-olds. Okay? So we wanted to actually figure out if there's a test score gap at 9 months old. Now, I know you're thinking, how could you possibly test a 9-month-old? I mean, they don't know anything. I agree, and that also may be true of 9-year-olds. But for a 9-month-old, what they do is they give them the Bailey scale of infant development. Okay, and so these are the words from the code book, not mine. I don't speak this way, but they want to know if a baby babbles expressively, or how long they can focus on an object. So you can do these at home. I do them with my friends' children. You can give them an object. If they focus really well, you pat them on the back and say, this is going to be a really, really well-educated child. If they look at it and immediately look at something else, sorry. The other thing they do is they like to take a bell and hide it under a cup. If the 9-month-old kind of knocks over the cup and giggles and looks at the bell, then you think, that's a future GSE student. If the baby starts crying and looks lost, yeah, change the conversation. And what's interesting about these tests is, even though they're a bit naive and strange to a person like me, the correlation between a 9-month-old test and the same kids when they're 12 years old is roughly 0.3. Okay? That's not a lot, but if you were to give a kid a college entrance exam at age 14 and give them the same exam at age 17, the correlation there is 0.67. So you're at least measuring some aspect of kind of persistent ability or achievement even as early as 9 months old. And what was so great about these data is that typically when you test a 9-month-old, something is wrong with them, frankly. It's a developmental delay, or they've been born with very low birth weight. This was the first representative sample in the US testing so many 9-month-olds. Okay? And here's what we found. If you just look at the distributions of 9-month-old kids, they couldn't overlap anymore. Okay? This is just in the raw data. Black students, white students, Hispanics, Asians, et cetera, are all very, very correlated at 9 months old. The only differences we found at 9 months old were that girls were slightly better on the Bailey scale of infant development than boys. But in general, they're very correlated. However, already by age 2, there are pretty stark differences that you actually can't explain anymore with the observables. Okay? Already by age 2, there's roughly a 0.4 to 0.5 standard deviation difference between children. If you move ahead, that same difference in the raw data exists when kids enter kindergarten. So when kids enter kindergarten in the US, they're 5 or 6 years old, minority children are already 8 months behind in the raw data. But what's interesting about that is that the whole gap can be accounted for by looking at things like home environment. You know, how many children's books you have in the home, the education of your parents. That totally wipes out the achievement gap when kids enter school. But what perplexed us for years was that the gap grows roughly 0.1 standard deviation per year while kids are in school, and no matter what we seem to throw at the data, we can't explain that. Okay? So here I've shown you the progression using 2 different data sets, the birth cohort of the ECLS and the kindergarten cohort of the ECLS. One starts from kindergarten to 8th grade, the other starts from 9 months old until kindergarten. Putting those 2 data sets together, you see that essentially kids lose ground all the way through school. Right? Remember Horace Mann? Horace Mann told us that education was the great equalizer. Not so much, because what we see is that actually kids lose ground in school. And another great thing about the ECLS is we have multiple tests kind of in the spring and in the fall. So we can see there's lots of theories out there that these gaps that I'm showing you emerge over the summer and not while kids are in school. And the theory is, well, kids are doing different things in the summer. You know, I grew up with my grandmother in Daytona Beach, Florida, and in the summer, you know, we went to shopping malls and looked for bargains. We didn't really go to museums or anything like that. I have a sense there was some museum going in this room. And the people argue that racial differences in the activities that kids engage in the summer is what produces these gaps, not the actual problem of the schools. And what we show is that it's the exact opposite, it seems, in the data. Kids don't lose ground over the summer, but they do lose ground exactly in the months that they're in school. Okay? We tested dozens of hypotheses of why this was true. All right, I know that at least for some of you, your minds are racing thinking, what could explain these divergent practices? We looked at things like poor parenting, so there are huge differences across races in how kids are parented. I've given one example here. 41% of black respondents say they spanked their kid. Other racial groups are relatively similar. So blacks are more likely to spank their kid. Whites give a lot of timeouts. I had to Google that to figure out what a timeout is, but I got it now. So they give timeouts relative to other racial groups. But those actually differences don't matter when you include them in a regression. They can't explain why black kids lose ground. There's been big theories about racism by teachers, as I described before, summer setback. Some people blame the standardized test. And school quality was one of our early hypotheses, which can explain some of the difference, but not all. So seeing all these data, seeing the gap expand, and 2 or 3 years ago, we just really were at a loss trying to figure out why is it that you have such differing performance of minority and non-minority students, and why can't it be explained by any of the traditional variables? Right? So I'll just give you a bit of a personal history. My grandmother was actually an educator for 35 years in Florida. She integrated schools in 1969, and we talk often. And so I asked my grandmother kind of, what do you think it is? Not regression techniques, but what do you just think? That'd be great if she could give me advice on that. But anyway, what do you think it is? And her sense, which I think is kind of conventional wisdom, is we need a larger percentage of teachers with master's degrees and more educated teachers. Or we need to spend more, which is a common education policy, at least in America and I think around the world. And we need to lower our student-to-teacher ratios. There's just too many kids in one classroom, and teachers can't teach that many kids. So we went and looked at the data, and what you see is that essentially education policy in America has followed precisely my grandmother's recommendation, which is they have, by more than twofold, increased the number of teachers with master's degrees in our K through 12 system. In 1961, there was roughly 23.5% of our teachers had master's degrees. In 2006, almost 62%. In terms of total expenditure per pupil, this is in real, constant 2008, 2009 dollars. Our spending has gone up from $5,000 per student to $12,000 per student. And one of the interesting things you'll see in the data is that now if you look at cities like New York City, for example, some of the worst schools are the most funded. In fact, if you look in the data, the correlation, I know it's just a correlation, but it's an interesting one, the correlation between spending and performance is negative, right? And some of the worst schools in New York I've ever been in, the ones where you need to go in with like a bodyguard, they're spending $20,000 per kid. I mean, for that price, they should just send them home and give them the $20,000. Student-to-teacher ratios in 1970 were roughly 22 to 1, and now they're 15 to 1, okay? And in really bad schools, in places like New York where people can opt out of the schools, you go into some of the really, really poor performing schools, and if you just looked at class size, you'd think you were in some of our nation's best private schools because there's only 10 kids to a class because no one wants to send their kids there, right? So more educated teachers, more money, lower student-teacher ratios. Our performance, exactly flat. Okay? So, in 2007, 2008, as befits an economist, I thought, we know the solution. We're economists. This is an easy thing. Economists would never do that. We would do this. We would offer kids incentives. Clearly, what's wrong is that kids don't have incentives on the demand side, and they're agents too, and just look at my model, they best respond. And so we decided to run some incentive programs in 5 cities. And we differentiated it between what we called input experiments, where we paid for behaviors, okay? So we started this in New York City. I'll start there. In New York City, that was our first experiment. And in New York City, what we did was we paid kids for high test scores. So we told them, if you get a high test score, we'll give you some money. Okay? And this was real money, like cash for kids. And so if you were a 4th grader, you could earn up to $250 that year. There was no special formula for how much to pay them, but I looked on Amazon and you could buy a video game console for $250, and I thought that's probably the right price point. So for 4th graders, you could earn $25 per test. There were 10 tests throughout the year, so a perfect score on each test would give you $250. And for 7th graders, it was doubled. So you can make $50 for the test. We gave 7th graders just $10 to complete the exam. Okay? People thought we were crazy. Why would you give them $10 to complete the exam? Because 20% of kids in the previous year on these exams just wrote their names at the top and turned them in. Okay? So we thought, hey, at least if they randomly guess, maybe test scores will go up, right? Because it's better than 0. That's what we did in New York City. And as we were doing this, I mean, this may be surprising to economists, but there were a lot of people who were very against this idea because I was told I was going to destroy the love of learning, to which I said, visit one of these schools, you'll see it's already destroyed. And that the very sanctity of education was at risk. In fact, on a panel when we were ramping up to give these experiments, a very conservative commentator stood up on the panel and pointed their finger at me and says, what's next? Paying kids not to bring guns to school? And I thought, that's a pretty good idea. In Chicago, we pay for grades. And you all know that kind of traditional economic theory would say pay for outputs because different kids learn in different ways. They know how they learn, you don't. And so if you pay for outputs, it's like an implicit subsidy on the various inputs that they might do. Okay? So for me, if I read best for comprehension and to get ready for test, if you put the incentives on the output, I'll read. If someone else does better by making flashcards, well, you put the incentives on the output, they'll make the flashcards. All right? So do the output, the kids will figure it out, and that'll give you the best bang for your buck. Well, we juxtapose that with paying for actual inputs. So in Dallas, we paid kids $2 a book to read books. Okay? And yes, I know that's bad. People are not going to read Beowulf for the pure joy of Beowulf, but they'll do it for the money. In Washington, D.C., on the recommendation of my conservative friend on that panel, we paid kids not to beat each other up. We paid kids to come to school and to not disrupt class. Okay? In Houston, we paid them to master math objectives. In Dallas, we paid them to read. In Houston, we paid them to master math objectives. In total, across these 5 experiments, we spent roughly $10 million, and we opened up bank accounts for each kid. Okay? And a lot of the kids don't have Social Security numbers in the U.S., so I know more about the Patriot Act than I ever should know. But we opened up bank accounts for them, and they were kid-based bank accounts. We went to great lengths to make sure that the parents couldn't take the money out of them, and we deposited the money into the bank accounts for kids and brought financial literacy classes for the kids so that they wouldn't just spend their money. And I'm not sure the financial literacy worked, to be honest with you. I was visiting a school, and I asked the kid, "Are you saving your money?" He says, "Absolutely. Just like they told us, I save it for a month, then I spend it." I think if you take the regular discount rate for a kid, a month is a long time. So, here are the results we got. Very different than anything I expected. In Dallas, where we paid kids to read books, their reading comprehension scores went up. These are months of schooling. These are standard deviations. Okay? So just remember that reducing class size in the classic Project STAR experiment cost roughly $3,500 per kid. It gave an effect size that was roughly 0.2 standard deviations. That's roughly the effect size here, but we paid $40 per kid. Okay? In D.C., this is not shaded in because there were only 17 schools in D.C. in our treatment group. So with statistical error, this is not statistically significant, just as the coefficient. In Houston, we also got positive results. In Chicago and New York, where we paid for outputs, we got absolutely nothing. Okay? And so on the one hand, this was interesting from an academic standpoint in the sense that input incentives seem to be more important than output incentives. And in fact, when you talk to the kids, it's quite interesting because I said to them, you know, in the New York experiment, were you excited? Totally excited by the money. What did you do? Just got excited. And I said, well, you didn't think to stay after school? Mm-mm. You didn't think to do your homework? No, not at all. And so what we realized from the focus groups were the kids seemed to be very, very excited, but unlike our assumptions, they didn't really know the production function. They didn't really know how to turn that excitement into tangible behavior that would result in achievement. And, you know, through lots of focus groups, essentially, they told us we got excited, we didn't know what to do. Right? It would be equivalent to us going this afternoon and taking a random person on the street and saying, I will give you $10 million to solve the Riemannian hypothesis. They probably would get very excited until they realized it was the Riemannian hypothesis. Right? And I think that's kind of a stark example, but I think algebra to a kid who's 2 years behind might as well be the Riemannian hypothesis. We did something similar on teacher incentives, and I just want to briefly talk about this because it's such a big policy area in the US and in the UK. We gave teachers output experiments as well in New York City. There's other experiments that have gone in other places, and essentially all of these have shown 0 results. Okay? We have not found one example in the US of providing incentives for outputs that we care about resulting in tangible increases in student achievement. Okay. So this is all to say, by this time, we were very frustrated. The conventional wisdom seems to be failing. We paid $10 million out of private money, to increase achievement among students, and we got some results in the input experiments, but not many in the output experiments. And in fact, when you look across all of the kind of credibly evaluated programs in the US to increase student achievement amongst disadvantaged populations, you find that the achievement gap is roughly 1 standard deviation. The treatment effect of all our favorite programs are a very, very tiny fraction of that. Okay? So while we know test scores are important for things like economic growth and for equalizing differences that happen because of accidents of birth, we just don't know at this point how to actually equalize those test scores. And then a graduate student of mine who's actually here, and I stumbled on data from the Harlem Children's Zone. Okay? The Harlem Children's Zone is a 97-block area in central Harlem, New York, where they combine community and school investments. And one of the most interesting things about the Harlem Children's Zone is that they do both of these investments. So when you have a figure that looks like this, it causes everyone to blame everyone else. Okay? So people in the schools say it's the teachers' unions. The teachers' unions say it's the schools. The schools say it's the parents. Right? And there are all these it's all this blame that goes around. I mean, I don't know how many times I've heard, there's nothing we can do. Their parents don't care. And I try to respond by saying, the parents are sending you the best kids they have. They don't hide the good ones at home. So we have to do something. The Harlem Children's Zone is a great laboratory for trying to figure this out because they have a charter school which frees them up from a lot of the bureaucratic regulation of traditional public schools. And they also do a bunch of community investments. So they go out and they spend, I think, at this time we did this analysis, they spend roughly $55 million per year, okay? $50 million trying to develop the community in Harlem, okay? Cleaning up the streets, lowering violence, all of the stuff that you'd want to do to try to increase the community capital. They spend $5 million on the actual schools, okay? And here's what we found when we analyzed lottery-level data from kids in the Harlem Children's Zone. The bars here are when kids were actually admitted into Harlem Children's Zone. So they were admitted April 14th of their 5th grade year, all right? And the reason they used a lottery is because when charter schools are oversubscribed, as part of New York state law, you have to admit via random lottery, okay? So this gives us a nice test of this. So what we have here is the average white student in New York City. The dashed line here is the average black student in New York City. And then I have here kids who won the lottery and kids who lost the lottery. And the reason it's important to put all these in the same figure is that there's lots of worry about maybe only the motivated parents can sign up for a lottery, right? Some of the lottery applications from popular charter schools in America are 12 pages long. You've got to initial every page, right? For parents of disadvantaged kids, a lot of times they won't go through that rigmarole to actually get their kids into a good school. Here what I'm showing you, again, what's great about the Harlem Children's Zone is they have volunteers who go into laundromats, check cashing places, into housing projects and knock on doors and they solicit people for their lottery relative to waiting for them to come to the Harlem Children's Zone. So as you see here, that strategy has kind of worked because the average kid in New York City, average black student in New York City, those who won the lottery and those who lost the lottery are roughly the same in the year pre-intervention, okay? In 6th grade, you see they go up a little bit. In 7th grade, they go up a little bit more. And by 8th grade, they've essentially closed the gap. There's a little bit difference here, but statistical error would show you that this is roughly the same. And in fact, if I plotted this for a 4th year, we'd have another social problem. It'd be a white-black gap, right? Because they actually start outperforming the kids, the average white students in New York City. That's for math. In reading, you see something quite different. So in math, you can essentially eliminate the gap in 3 to 4 years. Something does it. In reading, roughly 1/3 of the gap is minimized or reduced. Okay? So the question was for us, Will Dobie and I, what the heck is going on? First, the question was, Will, you made a coding error, go back and fix that. There's no way this is true. Once we got past that, it was, what are they actually doing? How is it possible that a school can close the gap? I mean, these are kids who are 90% female-headed households, almost 100% of them in poverty. They're drugs. They're all the social ills that are around that we've been saying you can't possibly educate students in these conditions for 50 years. But someone has actually shown it can be done. Moreover, it turns out that lots of people are starting to show that it can be done. And what's interesting about this is that the broad surveys of charter schools show that the average charter school is no better than the average public school. So if you free schools up from the constraints that typical bureaucracy has in terms of traditional public schools, that's labor unions, when you have to start your day, procurement for things like transportation, all of those things that are centralized in a traditional public school, if you decentralize them in a charter school, you don't get actually better results. Okay? However, there are schools like the Harlem Children's Zone, charter schools in Massachusetts, some charter schools in DC, and our nation's biggest charter organization, KIP, that have actually shown you can have Harlem Children's Zone-like effects. You can actually close the achievement gap in math in 3 to 4 years and reduce it substantially in reading. And the question for us became, okay, what are they doing? All right. So again, my grandmother. She's 86 years old now. And 7 years ago, I decided I really wanted to learn to bake like my grandmother. My grandmother can bake. I mean, I'm sure some of you can bake well too, but my grandmother, hands down, fantastic. The problem is that my grandmother doesn't really have recipes. Okay. So she does a lot of old school methods. So when I tell my grandmother, how much sugar does this cake have? She gives me answers like, a palm. I say, your palm or my palm? A pinch of this, a palm of that. So 7 years ago, I went down for Thanksgiving to my grandmother's house, and I really wanted to make one of her special cakes. And so I decided to hang out in the kitchen, and every time she grabbed something with her hand, I put a measuring cup underneath, and I learned that a palm is a quarter cup. It annoyed the hell out of my grandmother, but I got a recipe. And I decided maybe that's the method we should use for trying to figure out what some schools are doing well and what other schools are doing not so well, right? Because like my grandmother, the Harlem Children's Zone and KIP and some of these other organizations are doing phenomenal things for kids. We just had no idea what they were actually doing. Okay. So what we did was, like my grandmother's kitchen, we went for a year and annoyed some of the best and worst schools in New York City. So we went out and we gathered a bunch of data on lots of traditional inputs and things that are not so traditional. So we took cameras and put them in the classrooms to see what teaching methods they used. We interviewed the kids, we interviewed the teachers, we interviewed the principal for a couple of hours. We got copies of their lesson plans. We got copies of the homework that they assigned. And then when all of these data came into our lab, I don't know, it must have been 800 pounds of sample homework or something. We got some trusty, dusty undergraduates, and we coded all this data up to make a data set that on the left-hand side, what you could have is the effectiveness of the charter school, kind of measured by this lottery data, and that's why it's great to do this in charter schools. And on the right-hand side, you could have all the data that we collected through this process. Okay? Here's what we found, which won't be surprising, but then we'll get to the actual experiment. This is all a build-up to the actual experiment. What we found was that traditionally collected measures like class size, per pupil expenditure, whether or not your teachers have certification, whether or not they have master's degrees, and an index of all of those variables, if anything, is negatively correlated with success in charter schools. Again, what we have is we have a distribution of charter school success, okay? On the right part of that distribution are places like the Harlem Children's Zone that are doing phenomenal things for kids. Jeff Canada's like an American hero, okay? And that's great. On the left part of that distribution, you have schools that should be shut down this afternoon. And what we did was we correlated the things they're actually doing in the schools with where in that distribution they are. Okay, really, really simple, just trying to understand what predicts the effectiveness of a school. So these things don't matter. What did matter was how often your teachers got feedback on their instructional practice. Okay? Whether or not you use data to actually drive instruction. So what does that mean? In a bad school, what happens is that they teach, or not, play games, whatever they do. And then around April or May, they take an exam. In June, 2 weeks before the school ends, they get the exam results back. They realize that 80% of the kids fail, and they say, that's too bad, and they go home for summer vacation. In the in the schools that are more effective, what they do is they teach in units, like 4 to 6 weeks. They get the data back on the precise skills that the kids have not mastered, so you haven't mastered linear equations with one unknown. And then the teachers actually go back and reteach the things in which many students were failing. Okay? I know that sounds incredibly simple and obvious, but we've been collecting these data for the last 100 years and not these. Tutoring. That's putting kids in groups of 6 or less, 4 or more days per week to just work on basic skills that they're actually have not mastered yet. Instructional time. How much time you spend in school per day and how much time kids spend in school during the year. It's the basic physics of education. If you're behind, you have 2 choices. You can either go longer or you can ask the other guys, could you please stay home? Right? So you need differential time in order to make up these big differences. And the last part is whether or not you have high expectations. The principals reported that high expectations were a must in their school. And what do we mean by this? We mean that everybody understands that poverty is a given and all these other social ills are a given. The schools that had poor performance looked at kids who were in poverty and said, that's just really bad that you're in poverty. We shouldn't expect so much from you because look how much you have to deal with. Poor you. The schools that we saw that were actually highly effective had the same type of students, but basically said, that's too bad. Now let me teach you the Pythagorean theorem. Okay? That they had high expectations for kids. And these things actually explain roughly 50% of the variance in why some schools are effective and some schools aren't. Okay? So there they are. Now, we had these 5 tenets, we call them: more time, tutoring, how you develop teachers, using data to drive instruction, and culture and expectations. And we wanted to do this as an experiment. Okay? The correlations are one thing, but we wanted to go in and take a set of traditional public schools where you have lots of disadvantaged children, none of which would likely sign up for a charter school lottery, and put these tenants in regular old public schools to see the types of results you could get. Okay? We tried this many, many places, which I won't bore you with, places like Omaha and Detroit. Detroit has 3% of its kids at grade level. When we showed them these 5 things, it says, we don't need that kind of reform. I was like, okay. We even went to Haiti after the earthquake when they had no schools, and they still wouldn't let us do it. But Houston decided that their schools were in such bad shape that they would allow us to do these 5 tenets in those schools as a way of seeing, can what we've learned from charter schools in this particular laboratory be transplanted into traditional public schools. Okay? So here's how we did it. The first thing we wanted to do was increase instructional hours per year. That's the most straightforward. So pre-intervention in the Houston public schools, they had roughly 1,250 hours, instructional hours per year. Unsuccessful charter schools have roughly 1,400. Unsuccessful meaning they're in the left part of the distribution, 1,400 hours per year. Post-intervention, we increased the hours to roughly 1,550 hours per year, so that's a 21% increase in instructional hours, and that's roughly equivalent to what the successful New York City charters are doing. Again, in order for this experiment, for me to convince you that this is the right experiment, I've got to get as close to those high achieving charters as I can under the constraints of a public school system. Okay? Teacher departure rates. Speaking of departure, don't leave when I talk about teacher departure. So you see, over the years pre-experiment, this is in our schools, in the treatment schools, and a set of comparison schools. Okay? You see that both of them are trending downward, which typically happens in schools that are poor performing. The teachers are staying there because no one is holding them accountable. In the treatment year, what you see is a spike up to roughly 52%. Okay? So as a part of this experiment, 52% of the teachers were removed from the schools and all of the principals. So there are 20 schools, all 20 principals were removed, and 52% of the principals, the teachers. Now, who do we replace them with? Well, this is kind of part of the story. Those who left are in the dark bars here. Okay? So this is teacher value added, which is essentially how much, what's the marginal increase in test scores that you can attribute to that particular teacher. A teacher with high value added is considered to be an effective teacher. A teacher with low value added considered to be not such an effective teacher. And this is all relative to the school district mean. Let me back up. Houston is the 7th largest school district in America. It has roughly 300,000 kids in it, 300 schools. It is 70% Black and Hispanic. In our schools, essentially, they're 100% Black and Hispanic, 51% Hispanic, 49% Black, all high poverty schools. All of these schools were about to be taken over by the federal government if we didn't actually implement some sort of reform. That was the only reason Houston was really willing to do this, was because they were no longer going to be Houston schools. They were going to be, I don't know who would claim them, but federal government schools, if not, okay? So, back to value added. What you see here, and this is an important, I think, important lesson, those who left were the really negative value added teachers, okay? So roughly 400 teachers, that's about 52%, roughly 400 teachers were removed. Some of them left themselves because they didn't want to work the extra hour, because we lengthened the school day an hour per day and 2 weeks per year. Some of them left on their own because they just didn't want to work the extra hour. And you see here, those that left had worse value added than those who stayed. However, those who stayed, it wasn't like we found a magical drawer of amazing teachers, okay? They're still negative relative to the district mean, just not as negative, okay? Another part of the process was that we re-interviewed every single teacher in the school, okay? And one of my favorite questions on the interview was, what do you need to turn this school around? A non-trivial fraction of teachers just said, smarter kids. Tutoring. So we wanted to tutor every kid in a 2-on-1 setting, 2 kids, 1 tutor, to really, so that they could really focus on those students. And tutoring was a full-time position, so it is a full-time position. So each tutor has 10 kids per day. There are 5 periods in the school day where they tutor. There's 2 per period. They tutor them for roughly an hour, and so each tutor has 10 kids. We paid them $20,000 per year with the opportunity to earn a bonus up to $5,000, okay? Now, you know, this was 2010, so maybe the recession had something to do with this, but no one thought we'd ever get any tutors for $20,000. Well, 1, it's a recession. 2, it's Houston. In Houston, Texas, $20,000 can buy you a mansion, so it was okay. What we put out our ads, and in 6 weeks, we had 1,200 applications for our 250 tutoring spots. We tutored in 6th and 9th grade only because of budget constraints, and we tutored in math because, frankly, we were starting very quickly, and I understood the knowledge map for math. You know, addition, subtraction, then decimals. Those of you who know me personally know I don't really know the knowledge map for reading very well. So we started in math, and now we've expanded to math and reading in our 2nd year. In the other grades, 7th, 8th, 10th, 11th, and 12th, rather than a tutoring period throughout the day, the kids had, they went to a computerized, they had computerized instruction for the hour, okay, in reading or math. So all told, middle school students received approximately 215 hours of tutoring, and the high school students received 189 hours of tutoring. When it came to using data to drive instruction, we had benchmarks every 6 weeks. We broke the benchmarks down by skill, by student, and gave the data back to the principals and the teachers so they could see the deficiencies in which their kids had. The last thing on culture and expectations is really hard for me to try to demonstrate to you that culture in the school changed. It's a very hard thing to quantify. The only thing I can show you is that on the interview responses, when we interviewed all the teachers, those who left had worse interview responses across the board than those who stayed. Right? So those who left were the ones who said things like, you don't need to waste your money, all we need is smarter kids. It's not our fault that they're doing badly. It's their fault. They're the ones who are not learning. We're teaching fine. Those are the teachers that were removed. Those who stayed gave answers such as, if we just had a little more time, I think we could get it done, or we need different textbooks, or something that was tangible that could actually be used, not just excuses poured on the heads of the kids. So here's some other very anecdotal things about culture and expectations, which I find kind of interesting. So pre-treatment, when I first walked into these schools, Addix Middle School in Houston, it was the spring before our experiment started in the fall. And I just wanted to get a sense of the schools. I'd never visited these schools, so I just wanted to get a sense of what they were like. So I walked into Addix Middle School, and the kids took the piano. It was their graduation, and it was supposed to be like this really great day, and so a few kids walked across the stage to get their 8th grade caps and gowns, and they huddled together around the piano and pushed it off the stage. Between classes, they would put baby powder, or some sort of powder, in the hallway, and then they had lines of kids that would run as fast as they could and slip down the hallways on the baby powder. Okay? It looked like a very fun environment, but I could understand why proficiency levels were quite low. In the treatment fall, when I went back to the schools, we had a team of people from our lab who every month go down to each school for a full day to monitor the experiment. Okay, so they go down to make sure that the tutors are being used appropriately, for example. You would be surprised that in a lot of these neighborhoods and schools, if you give them a lot of tutors and you don't monitor them, they take the tutors to do something else. And so we wanted to make sure that the experiment was being run properly. In the treatment fall, the biggest complaint was that everyone was tired because of the extra hour. The day is too long. The kids can't possibly concentrate like this. This is just, it's too much. It's just too much. In fact, in that treatment fall, in one of our schools, I asked the teachers in a teacher focus group, how is the year going? And the teacher said to me, well, you know, it's fine, but I don't understand why we're wasting all these resources. I said, what do you mean wasting resources? And they said, well, we're 35 kids away from being a great school. If you just took out those kids, the ones that failed, we'd be a fantastic school. Still a lot of excuses in the treatment fall. By spring of our first year, things were starting to look up, okay? And so when I talked to the kids then, there was no complaints of fights anymore, no complaints of teachers not teaching. The biggest complaint in the treatment spring was that the food in the cafeteria really sucks. And I had a hamburger that wasn't any good, and this is an exact quote from a student, the apples taste like soap, okay? And I thought this was real progress. We didn't have the test scores back, but these seemed like middle-income problems. In our best schools, I think the apples still probably taste like soap, and so we'll try to figure that out. Okay. Here are the treatment effects that we found. In the grades that we tutored, these are all in standard deviation units, you see very large effects. Okay, so 6th grade math, this is roughly 0.5 standard deviation increase in test scores. In 9th grade math, 0.73 increase in test scores. So if you just looked at the achievement gap, this would be enough to eliminate 2/3 of the achievement gap with these students in just 1 year. In 7th grade, we didn't do quite as well. And in reading, we did quite poorly. 10th and 11th grade, you see larger jumps. And so this gives you the kind of combined middle school and the combined high school effect. Probably the best way to demonstrate this is to put it in context. This is the average New York City charter school in math and reading. Not good, but not great. This is the Harlem Children's Zone. Remarkable evidence that they can close the achievement gap in 3 to 4 years. They don't do as well on reading. These are yearly effect sizes, by the way. This is the average KIPP school, which is one of our nation's most lauded charter schools, and similar in reading. If you just look at the effects combined across all of our grades in Houston in year 1, you find effects that are statistically identical to the other 2 major charter schools, and the reading gaps are just as bad as the other charter schools. If I do a simple calculation of cost benefit, so we spent $1,837 more per kid than Houston was spending. That money was raised privately, and we used private dollars to do all of these, to do this experiment. And you take those, the treatment effects that I just showed you, and you correlate those with what you'd expect given the higher test scores with later life outcomes like higher wages that the government can tax, et cetera, then you get an internal rate of return of roughly 22%. Okay? If you compare that to early childhood education, which I think we all agree is a great idea, that's roughly 7.6% of a return. Reduced class size efforts, which cost $3,500 per kid, get you roughly 6.2. The historical returns in the stock market, okay, not including the last couple months, but the historical returns in the stock market are roughly 5.8%. So that means for a government, this is a really good investment, whether you're turning around schools or doing early childhood. But I wanted to give you these results in context of other initiatives that are widely done. Okay. This year, we've expanded to 11 randomly selected elementary schools in Houston. So we have our full 20 schools there. We have 7 schools in Denver. In these schools, there's roughly 20,000 kids. And you know, the model is very far from perfect. I have no idea how to think about these reading scores, for example. And when we talk to the teachers, we ask them, how do we think about reading? And they said to us, we're English teachers. We're not reading teachers. So their basic sense was, and I don't think it was an excuse, was that if a kid comes into 6th grade reading at a 4th grade level, I have no idea what to do. Because in my training to become a teacher, I learned the subtleties of Shakespeare's comedies, but I have no idea how to teach a kid to decode and do the things needed to actually teach them to read at such a late age, right? And so what we did this year was we put all of our teachers in a training program that you would normally put primary school teachers in to teach them to help kids learn how to read, right? Our preliminary evidence from this year, which is not quite ready for public yet, is that our reading scores have increased a little. Not as much as math, but they have increased a little, right? So we really need to figure out how we can get our reading scores up, because it may well be that reading scores are actually more correlated with college success than are the math scores. Speaking of college, 100% of the kids in our 4 high schools got into college, okay? It sounds better than it is, okay? I mean, it sounds great, 100% of kids in college. Here's actually what happened. I locked them in the gym, and I said, if you want to go home, you will apply to college. So it turns out you get 100%. But more important is that the increase in kids who actually went to 4-year colleges over the comparison group is roughly 18 percentage points, which is 60% increase in kids who have gone to college, right? So, and that's not even really on the human capital margin. That's just on the annoying mother margin, right? That's on the parents nagging you, principal nagging you to go to school margin. Whether they'll do well, I don't know. But our enrollment numbers, 64% of the kids in these schools actually went to college, and these are the worst performing schools in Houston. And you know, just to conclude, there really are no more excuses for why we can't do this work, right? So for years, we've been saying things like it's poverty, or it's their parents, or it's their community, or what can we do? And lucky for us, there were a few kind of practitioner geniuses like Jeff Canada in the Harlem Children's Zone and Dave Levin in KIPP schools who have shown us that some combination of investments in disadvantaged children can raise their test scores in significant ways. Now, what we've done in this experiment is to try to extract what that secret sauce is and put it into traditional schools with labor unions, with a school board, with apathetic parents, with everything that a traditional school will have. And what we're finding, it's very early, after year one, is that we're getting effects that are statistically identical to the best charter schools. And this is not only an American problem, but in the Turkish ghettos of Vienna, in the Somali ghettos in East London, there are all sorts of kids disadvantaged by accidents of birth who are in very, very underperforming schools. And what we've shown is that a pretty simple recipe of getting reasonable teachers and using data and trying to change the culture of the building can have a big effects on their lives, right? So the experiment was done in Houston, Texas, but I actually think its ramifications are far more important, potentially for Europe than it is for America. And the reason is you guys have a much heftier safety net than we do. And the larger the populations in places like Spain and in the UK and Germany, that the larger the populations that you have of undereducated, unemployable youth who are coming up, like the Africans in the French suburbs, who are not getting educated, the stronger the draw will be on the economy. When everything's in prosperity, we can afford all the social programs. When we're not, we have to make tough choices. And what we're trying to demonstrate is that if those tough choices are made in K through 12 education, they can actually have longer run returns that are good for the economy and good for basic civil rights. All right, thank you.
Thank you. It was an excellent lecture. I'm sure Tony would have been very proud and happy to see something like this, combining economic theory to practical, important problems. And yes, I'm sure we have a lot to learn here in Barcelona and Catalonia, too. We just have time for a couple of questions. Any question or any?
Try to link the performance of African Americans to the so-called acting white. So I was wondering, since you haven't mentioned anything about it, I was wondering if you could tell us what you think about this.
Sure. So we tried to gather empirical data a few years ago on kind of racial differences in the negative peer pressure, which is what you're describing for black and white students. And contrary to what a lot of the sociologists had reported, what we found was that in schools that were predominantly black, there was really no acting white going on. It was in schools that were more integrated. And if you think about it, I guess it kind of makes sense. It's hard to act white when there's no whites around. Then you're just weird, I guess. So in these schools, these are predominantly minority schools. So we didn't hear a lot of that. But what you do see is that the principals and the teachers really trying to actively change the culture so that achievement is the thing to be sought after. So I think acting white could potentially be important for trying to explain differences in college performance where you're integrated on campuses, or differences in the performance of better schools. But these traditionally underperforming, failing schools where they're 100% minority, I don't think it's a big issue of why they're underperforming.
I guess a lot of my knowledge of public schools in the States comes from The Wire. I think it's pretty accurate. I don't know, it seemed to be. But the part where you talked about giving incentive for the students, I thought that was really interesting. I was just wondering what your personal thoughts are on the effectiveness of that. It seems like something that was part of an experiment or a program and then was maybe stopped or shelved. But it just seems like if, I don't know, if parents or teachers could give students the incentive to put in the work at home or independently or something, like get them, I guess, eventually more invested in their future or what they can get out of it. Maybe first for the money or for, I don't know, I'll get you some candy, but later. I was just wondering if you thought that was something that would be followed through, or if the approach of seeing what the KIPP schools did and then emulating that is more effective on the long run.
Yeah, I have to admit a certain level of frustration with the incentives work. In Houston, we did an experiment kind of parallel with the Turnaround Schools project, in which we gave incentives for parents, for teachers, and for kids, all for the same objective, hoping to do what I think you described, which is get the parents to be more incentivized at home, or to provide the kids with more incentives at home. What we showed there was that we could get them to do a lot of homework that way. So they did 1 standard deviation more math homework than the control group. The issue was when it came to the test, their test scores went up, which I showed you in the graph, but not by that much. And the reverse of it is, you've heard of moral hazard, the reverse of it is that their reading scores actually went down. So what happens when we gave incentives for math, I think the parents and the teachers and the kids all focused on math to the detriment of their actual reading scores. So the net result was 0, math scores went up, reading scores actually went down.
Well, after your great lecture, I'm definitely convinced about the importance of tests for math and English, but I was wondering maybe there's a little bit of an, I don't know how to call it, but like an American obsession with math and English, and I was wondering if maybe it's just because these things are testable, and whether you had evidence for other sorts of performances which might be very, very important, maybe once kids go to college, things as basic as writing and as strange as extracurriculars or things like that. So I was wondering if you can expand a little bit on that.
Yes, so this year we should have, it depends in Houston on the grade levels they test. So math and reading I did because the charter schools only have to do math and reading. So that's, I guess you're right, we have an obsession of math and reading. But this year we should have results back from social studies and history and writing for some of our grade levels, and so we'll be able to put that in the paper. The other thing that you said, though, I think is really, really important, which is there may be things that are non-test score related that are actually more correlated with doing well in college than the test scores themselves. And so one of the things we will do next year is collect data on all sorts of non-cognitive skills. So is it that what happened is that the better teachers and the better principals gave our students more of a sense of resilience or grit and determination that made them want to study more, and that's really what increased the test scores. So maybe the first thing that was increased were these non-cognitive skills, which then increased the test scores. And if those non-cognitive skills are important, maybe they carry on to college, and that turns out to be actually more important than the test scores. I don't know, but I view this as a starting point for, I will be boring you with these results for years to come as we track down the students and watch them as they make important life choices, right? In 4 years, we'll see if they graduated from college on time. We'll be able to see their income in 10 to 15 years to really see if these things translate into the later life outcomes that we hope for.
So this will be consistent with Hacken's work.
Exactly. Yeah.
Just one last question.
I was just wondering about attendance, because I would imagine that kids, if schools are really bad, then kids would just stop going to class. Like, did attendance increase when you started your program? Or how, yeah.
I didn't really hear. Did you say, did attendance increase?
Yeah, like, did kids start going to class more?
Oh, no,
Was
okay, yeah. So it's measured with statistical error, so it's not significant, but the coefficient is actually positive on daily attendance. Given the fact that we went 2 more weeks and 1 more hour, that means the amount of instructional hours actually went up. So even if the attendance rates were zero, the difference in attendance rates were zero, that would mean that the kids in the treatment actually got more school. We were a little worried about that, and the kids threatened. Over the summer, they said, "Oh no, we're just going to leave school at 4 o'clock like usual." Turns out they were bluffing, thankfully.
Last one there.
Yes, from what you described, it seems that you've been managing very closely what you've done in schools. So I was wondering whether part of this success could be just that they had, like in this school, they had such a great new manager, which was you, or maybe in the other charter school, there was like a change in management, and that makes you be able to find what is the right mix of ingredients for these schools, but it could actually be different if you want to expand the program to much more schools.
You should come work for me for 6 months to see how bad I am at managing stuff. That probably would take that worry away from you. But I think that there is concern that maybe the superintendent had their eyes on this more than any other project, and that's why it happened. And I obviously don't have any data to tell you that's not correct. But even if it were that type of placebo effect, that would be great. That means we should just tell all superintendents, pay close attention, and that's even more scalable than what I've shown you, because what I showed you requires a lot of human capital turnover, right? So I hope it's as you describe, because the worry 2 years ago was that you couldn't replicate these results because they were done by Jeff Canada and Dave Levin, who are both geniuses, and so you can't replicate genius. Now, and the people call them Superman, right? So you can't replicate Superman. Well, now we've done it in 27 schools with 20,000 kids, and I think people think you can replicate super nerds. So I mean, I don't think and there's a lot of people out there who are good managers. So my sense is that the supply curve of talent that it would take to just do simple things like say, did you test? What are the results from the test, and give it back to them in a systematic way. I think we can do that. We do that in a lot of other aspects of business, and I think we can do that in our schools. So I think that part is replicable. The thing that I worry about is the supply of talent to teach in these schools. So for these principals that we all replaced, the 20 principals that we replaced, we probably did 300 interviews, right? And because first, no one really wanted to teach to lead these really dysfunctional schools. And so those who applied didn't have a real good track record of achievement. And so I think that's the limit to scalability is, can we find the talent necessary to go in and work miracles on the behalf of disadvantaged kids? Because they only have, whether it's 6 or 7 hours, they only have 7 hours to make up for poverty in the community and parents that may or may not be engaged. So it's really hard work, and the question is, do we have the supply of people willing to do that? I think that's the constraint, not on the management side.
Well, thanks once more. We have now, as you know here, we always have to have a cava after the talk like this. So, moltes gràcies. I moltes gràcies a tots per vindre. I és a baix que tenim el cava. Thank you again.